Good morning to all our friends in South Africa, and good afternoon to all our students, faculty colleagues, and all attendees from India. So, indeed, it's a privilege for me to welcome our honorable speaker today, Professor Mpedi. No need to speak much about him, about his credentials and works, all it is in public domain. Once again, gratitude to Professor Mpedi for expressing and gracing this session. And once again, I'm thankful to our director, ma'am, Professor Shreya, and all my colleagues to giving me the opportunity to welcome and moderate this session. I'm Dr. Dev. I teach sociology here, and I'll see the best output we can derive from this session to be much more fruitful so that we all can utilize in our day-to-day life. And talking about that, before going to the topic itself, some housekeeping points for our attendees, for the students especially. Keep your mic on mute, and we are all there to help you out to drop your question in the chat box. So nobody should answer it direct. Nobody should put it directly to sir. I'm there to handle it out. And as far as possible, we all should be interactive so that we can take best advantage of this. And going to the topic straight, I think being a sociologist, I can only summarize in a word: the COVID-19 has freezed our sociality. This is what possibly I can say at this platform. Without wasting much of time, I'll go through this bio of our Professor Mpedi. So there are plenty of key takeaways from his work all over the world, as he's associated with the Max Planck Institute in Germany. We all are quite familiar with that. Then he is basically interested in the areas of law, and he has been honored with so many prestigious awards at national, at international level. And being an Indian, we do share a common history with South Africa, which I think we all are eagerly waiting to listen from him. So without wasting much of time, I'm handing over these sessions to virtual floor to sir. Sir, please.
Thank you, program moderator, Dr. Hota, Director Parik, Prof. Shreya, distinguished guests, colleagues, students. Good afternoon. I believe it's good afternoon in India, and good morning from here in South Africa. And also good morning to colleagues who might have joined from South Africa or from the continent. For me, it is an honor and a privilege to be addressing you this morning. I would have loved this to be in person, but due to reasons you may know and other reasons related to work pressure, I couldn't do this. This brings back really fond memories of my time in Ahmedabad in 2020, at the beginning of 2020. When COVID was just a rumor, you know, and people were saying, are you going to India? Aren't you scared of COVID? I said, I'm going, you know. And if you ask me, I never thought it would turn out like this. I thought it will pass like SARS, you know. So I traveled to India, and I see Prof. Shreya is smiling because she was my host together with other colleagues. And we had a lovely time during the International Month, where I lectured and engaged with the brilliant students and colleagues of the Institute of Law at Nirma University. And after that, sadly, we never had a chance to reconnect, and here we are today. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, today I will be addressing you on COVID-19 and social protection in the Southern African Development Community: impact, responses, and lessons. So this is from a regional perspective. In Southern Africa, we have a regional body called SADC, or the Southern African Development Community. And I thought I should look at this important topic from that point of view. I would like to share with you my roadmap this morning so that you can see what I will be addressing you on in terms of the topics to be covered. I don't know if my slide is coming through. Is it coming through?
It is visible.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, thank you. Basically, thank you, Director Parik. I will provide you with a brief introduction, and this will be followed by a discussion on COVID-19 restrictions and the rule of law. As lawyers, you know, the rule of law is important, and we know how affected this rule of law was during the COVID. And even now, there are still questions about whether the rule of law is still being respected or not under COVID restrictions. And then I will address you just quickly on the confirmed cases and deaths, and just to show the connection with the topic of today. And then we'll talk about COVID-19 and its impact on human development. And then we'll talk about the labor market impact of COVID-19. And this will be followed by a discussion on the vulnerable groups and COVID-19 related challenges. And this will be followed by a discussion on social protection responses to COVID-19, some key observations from my side, and then there will be some concluding observations, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully that will provide us with enough information for us to have a meaningful discussion. Let me go straight to my brief introduction, colleagues. As you will all recall, ladies and gentlemen, the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic on the 11th of March, 2020. Then the Southern African Development Community, in brief SADC, were not spared the ordeal of the pandemic, and that includes my own country, South Africa. It is correct, ladies and gentlemen, that some SADC countries were and are still more affected than others. If you look at South Africa, my own country, is the most affected by this deadly virus, irrespective of how you look at it. And as a result, you know, with this talk, I intend to review the impact of COVID-19 on the SADC member states. Then I continue by analyzing the responses of the various SADC countries, and with a particular emphasis on social protection. And in addition, I will be highlighting some gaps, challenges, and lessons learned, or lessons to be learned. In essence, ladies and gentlemen, I argue that while the social protection systems of the region have been used in one form or another to mitigate the risks posed by COVID-19, there are some gaps and challenges that require attention. And this include the exclusion and marginalization of vulnerable groups such as migrant workers and the informal sector workers. The overall aim is definitely to share these gaps and so on, so that you know, SADC countries, you know, can use this to develop some policies, you know, that would help these countries to prepare better for future pandemics. We are told, ladies and gentlemen, that with this COVID pandemic, we need to realize that the future pandemics, there will be more, let me rephrase, there will be more pandemics in future, and they will hit us within short space of each other. So this is something that we should keep in mind. Let me start with the first point, which is COVID-19 restrictions and the rule of law. In their quest, ladies and gentlemen, to cap the spread and impact of COVID-19, which has been declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization, as I have already indicated, the Southern African Development Community members introduced a variety of interventions, which include the so-called lockdowns. I'm sure you're also familiar with this notion of lockdowns. There were restrictions on the movement of people and business operations. Distress relief and benefits were introduced. Workplace health and safety interventions and restrictions on work were also imposed. Now, what is appreciable, in my opinion, is the fact that these restrictions, which were directly and in some instances indirectly affected fundamental freedoms, were to a large extent based on law. and that pattern, you see it throughout the SADC region. So this, in my view, bodes well with the rule of law. There is a colleague of ours that is based in Eswatini, which is a country, it is one of the neighboring countries, of South Africa, and it's one of the SADC member states, Professor Shongwe. Professor Shongwe indicated, and I quote, that the rule of law is of crucial importance as it serves to avoid the arbitrary use of power, and it protects all people from human rights abuses that flow from arbitrariness. The exercise of state authority must be authorized by specific legislation or regulations made under the Enabling Act. It is also crucial that the law authorizing the exercise of public power must be certain and clear, not subject to conflicting interpretations, so that the public to whom the law applies knows what is expected of them. This is the principle of legality, unquote. Colleagues, this is extremely important, and many of you might have seen on television in many countries of the world, including my own country, there have been sadly some instances of police brutality while the police were enforcing the COVID-19 restrictions. I also saw in India police with sticks, beating out people in the streets who were alleged to have violated the COVID restrictions. So this is important and by this I refer now to this rule of law in enacting restrictions and enforcing them, that there is a balance of power and there is no arbitrariness that leads to the abuse of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, framing the COVID-19 rules and regulations in law, in my opinion, makes the restrictions somewhat accessible and predictable. People need to know what is it that is permissible and what is it that is not permissible under these lockdown restrictions. In addition, it makes these restrictions amenable to a legal challenge by those whose rights may be affected by the restrictions. It should be recalled, ladies and gentlemen, that the right to access to courts is recognized as a fundamental right by a variety of international human rights instruments, and indeed the constitutions of many SADC countries, as a human right. And after all, the rights are not absolute, they are limited, and which makes this COVID-19 rules and regulations to be subject to the limitation or clauses contained in a number of the constitutions of several SADC countries. I must also mention that as a result, restrictions on the freedom of movement, would have to comply with the limitation of fundamental rights clauses contained in this in the constitution of a variety of SADC countries. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to move over to point 2 on my outline, which is the confirmed cases and deaths. I need to touch a little bit on this because it links up with later points that I made. The available statistics at the time when I prepared this, which this talk is based on a chapter of a book that came out last year, and this was prepared at around May, but the numbers have changed, but the pattern remains the same, and if you look at the statistics, on COVID-19, you can see the picture that emerges, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the SADC region. The only way to describe it is to say it's a grim picture, ladies and gentlemen. And this is particularly clear when one looks at the cumulative confirmed COVID-19 cases, which are rising based on the waves and then dropping, but continuing. But if you look at them cumulatively and also the deaths, you will see that indeed, I'm not exaggerating when I say this is a grim picture. Obviously, members of the region are not affected the same, but if you compare all this, about 16 SADC countries, South Africa is the most affected with the highest number of deaths, with the highest number of COVID cases, and so on. This brings me to point 3 of my talk, which is COVID-19 and its impact on human development. It is extremely important, especially when people passes on and with these high numbers of infected, persons, you ask yourself, how is this pandemic impacting on human development? Taking into account that SADC as a region, SADC member states, many of them are characterized by underdevelopment. And this is a common thing, or common characteristic of many countries in the global south, or even regions in the global south. If you look at the Human Development Index of the SADC region, you'll see that it presents a less impressive picture. And what do I mean by this? Just by way of example, only Mauritius has been listed as a country with very high human development in the region. Colleagues, 6 out of 16 SADC countries are ranked as countries with low human development. Now here comes COVID. How does it impact on this human development? Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has been rightly described as an, and I quote, unprecedented shock to human development. In addition, the current disproportionately high levels of inequality prevalent in many countries of the region are expected to increase. And as such, it is hardly surprising that COVID-19 is expected to deteriorate the economy, poverty, and unemployment in SADC countries. This in turn undermines the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or the so-called SDGs, such as health, education, poverty, and inequality. And this is mainly because vulnerable groups are at heightened exposure to suffer from the impacts of COVID-19 due to the nature of their jobs, informality, which is widespread in the SADC region. And I'm sure you're also familiar with it, because I know that the informal sector is also huge in India. And limited access to quality health, safe non-public transport. A lot of our people rely on public transport that at best is unsafe. Water and sanitation is also another challenge that it needs to be flagged here. Colleagues, I'll move now to point 4, which is labor market impact on COVID-19. We just talked about human development. Now let's talk a little bit about the labor market impact. Many of you will remember that one of the biggest limitations or restrictions imposed by governments, including those, in the SADC region, and I know also the Indian government imposed some restrictions on the freedom of movement of individuals, And we know that freedom of movement is recognized as a fundamental right in many international instruments. And the situation is not different in the SADC region. SADC member states do recognize freedom of movement as a fundamental right. But I must be quick to point out that this right is not cast in stone. It can be limited in terms of the provisions of these constitutions. Now, this brings me to the point why I'm raising this, because as I said earlier, many SADC countries restricted the movement of persons, but this is not just about limiting people's movement. It also affected the ability of people to travel to work. So countries with the aim of curbing the spread of the disease imposed lockdowns, which compelled the so-called non-essential workers who could discharge their duties using duties remotely, using technology to do so. But ladies and gentlemen, not all workers could work remotely due to a variety of challenges, such as the lack of or limited internet connectivity. As a result, many workers went unpaid or received a fraction of their salaries. Some unlucky ones lost their jobs, as many businesses were not resilient enough to survive the pandemic. And as I will indicate later, many SADC countries introduce a variety of interventions to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. Notwithstanding the introduction of such measures, COVID-19, ladies and gentlemen, in a short space of time, battered the labor markets of the SADC countries. It should be remembered that the pandemic emerged at a time when countries such as South Africa were experiencing a technical recession. As a result, COVID pushed an already dire situation to become worse. I'll move over now to point 5, which is about the vulnerable groups and COVID-19 related challenges. These are just some selected perspective. Under this point, I would like to start with the so-called vulnerability indicator and its rationale. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, there is a variety of groups of persons who are, for a variety of reasons, vulnerable to COVID-19. These groups include the elderly, age 60 years. These are persons aged 60 years or older. And the rationale behind their vulnerability is because all age cohorts are at risk of contracting COVID-19. However, older people face substantial risk of developing severe illness if they contract the virus. This is due to their physiological reasons, to the physiological reasons that are associated with aging, such as increased morbidity and underlying health conditions. The next vulnerable group is the unemployed. And this is because persons who are unemployed may have limited finances to be able to eat nutritious meals, buy medication, and access healthcare facilities, among others. Another vulnerable group is the informal sector or part-time workers. Individuals who are engaged in the informal sector or on a part-time basis may be unable to work during the lockdown. When companies retrench, they start with part-time workers. The informal sectors, if people are locked down at their homes, then they have no business. They also have to stay at home. So as a result, the informal sector workers and the part-time workers may have limited finances to be able to eat nutritious meals, buy medication, access healthcare, and so on. Another vulnerable group is those living in informal dwellings or shacks. These are widespread in South Africa and many Southern African countries. Persons living in informal dwellings may have to share water points and sanitation facilities with others, which may make them more vulnerable to contracting COVID-19. This is a reality, ladies and gentlemen. Another vulnerable group is household members, a household with members with chronic conditions. Persons with chronic conditions may be more at risk of developing more serious symptoms. It's well known. The last vulnerable group I would like to touch on this afternoon in India, this morning in South Africa, is crowded households. Who are, or what are the crowded households? These are households with persons, with more than 6 persons. Persons, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, living in crowded households may not be able to self-isolate. That is, if that is necessary. They may also not be able to keep the necessary distance from each other. It's the reality. And one of the recommendations is that, if you show symptoms or if you've tested positive, you must self-isolate. But if you live in a crowded household, how do you self-isolate? It's just not possible. Having touched on these vulnerable groups, I want to zoom in on specific groups, poor families, and their vulnerability to shocks. It's almost like stating the obvious, ladies and gentlemen, that impoverished families are susceptible to shocks due to their precarious situation. And their ability to cope, with shocks is very limited, shocks such as COVID-19 and all that. And as a result, we need policy interventions that address the challenges faced by these groups, prior, during, and after shocks such as COVID-19. COVID-19 came and found these people already struggling. And as a result, SADC member states, and this is my argument, must reinforce measures aimed at ensuring that the indigent families remain resilient when confronted with shocks. Remember, those who know, those who can predict, say there will be more pandemics and they will take place in short succession. We need to ensure that the indigent families are well prepared for future pandemics. There are other selected groups which are workers. I touched on informal sector workers, and I want to zoom in on this category of workers. Informal sector work ladies and gentlemen, is widespread in the SADC region. For example, it is estimated that 9 out of 10 workers in Madagascar are engaged in the informal sector. Furthermore, it is estimated that 72.6% of the population aged 15 or above have an informal job. Workers employed in the informal sector are vulnerable because of the weak or no safety nets in that sector. The socio-economic challenges that emanated from the suspension of the economic activities and social distancing requirements aimed at curbing the spread of the pandemic are aggravated by the fact that the vulnerable, including informal sector workers, could not easily rely on the imperfect informal coping strategies that are normally relied on by the needy in times of crisis. And this is amid the spike of gender-based violence in some countries. South Africa is an example where there was a rise in gender-based violence during this difficult time. Furthermore, workers that eke a living in the informal sector could not readily ply their trade due to COVID-19. This is the situation even when they were granted permission subject to restriction to engage in informal work. The truth of the matter is that the situation will not be the same as before the lockdown due to the limited movement of potential customers. The COVID-19 pandemic, ladies and gentlemen, has resulted in significant job losses, particularly in the informal sector where job protection is weaker. This sector has been rightly labeled as a sector in distress. Some commentators have gone as far as calling informal sector workers the missing middle. This is mainly due to the following reasons. On the one hand, because of the low and unstable incomes and their employment status, they cannot afford or are ineligible to join social insurance schemes. Or on the other hand, most often they are not considered vulnerable or poor enough to qualify for social assistance grants. This is what we have witnessed in South Africa. While on this topic of informal sector workers, we should not forget the so-called informal cross-border traders who have not been spared the wrath of COVID-19 pandemic due to border closures. This has been highlighted by the African Union as follows, and I quote, "Women cross-border traders play a significant role in promoting the intra-African trade, contributing significantly to African continental free trade area. Given that the social security does not cover workers in these sectors, migrant workers are left to themselves to face COVID-19 impact," unquote. This is the reality. In SADC, colleagues, it's not unusual. We have a lot of informal cross-border traders, people traveling by bus, crossing the borders into South Africa to buy items to sell back at their own countries. And because of border closures, they couldn't do this. Alongside the informal sector workers, there are migrant workers that we should not forget. The advent of COVID-19 in the SADC region impacted migrant workers in a variety of ways, including the following, ladies and gentlemen. Restriction of freedom of movement. I've already talked about this. SADC countries impose travel restrictions to contain the spread of the pandemic to protect their populations and economies. Some migrant workers in countries such as South Africa traveled to their home countries to elude the impending lockdown. However, some migrant workers remain in the country. The reasons for such a decision at the start of the lockdown has been summarized as follows. More than 4/5, that is 82% of migrant respondents considered South Africa as their home, while 11% felt that the COVID-19 pandemic was global and that it would still be at risk, they would still be at risk regardless of whether they moved. 5% of migrant respondents indicated that they were concerned that if they left South Africa, they would be unable to re-enter South Africa when they wanted to. Protracted lockdown prevented some migrant workers from timelessly returning to work. And this, in some instances, affected their employment. Border closures, ladies and gentlemen, as I indicated, affected a lot of cross-border traders. COVID-19 has resulted in SADC countries locking down their borders and requiring their inhabitants to quarantine or maintain social distance. The restriction on cross-border travel resulted in pockets of migrants being stuck in their host countries, or those that traveled to their home countries before the lockdown being unable to return to their host countries. Their tenuous stance in the labor market is also something that we should not ignore. Colleagues, the position of migrant workers in the labor market tends to be more precarious than that of locals. It's a fact. Their vulnerability in terms of economic crisis extends over to their families. This is irrespective of whether such families are at home, that is a migrant sending country, or overseas, that is the host country where the migrant workers are employed. The economic crisis of 2008 is a perfect example. Migrant workers were invariably the first category of workers to be retrenched. This impacts negatively on remittances to families at home. The lack of or limited income invariably impact the migrant workers' ability to remit money to their home countries. It must be noted that the migrants' inability to send money has a negative impact on the migrants and their families, as well as their communities of origin. The situation is exacerbated by the restrictions on informal cross-border remittance channels due to the restrictions on movement and border closures. Now, this informal cross-border remittance of channels is important because, colleagues, Southern Africa has the most, is ranked as the most expensive region when it comes to the cost of remitting money. And as a result, the informal cross-border remittances, are the most common way of remitting money back home. So you give money to a taxi driver, a cross-border taxi driver, and when that driver crosses over, meets with a family member to hand over the money, which is the cheapest for many, migrant workers. The situation is exacerbated by the restrictions on, informal cross-border remittance channels, as I have explained, due to the restrictions on movement and border closures, and so on. So this is one point to be kept in mind. But talking about migrant workers, ladies and gentlemen, migrant workers are not immune, to health risks. They're exposed to health risks just like nationals. And this was rightly pointed out by the African Union when the African Union argued that the majority of migrant workers are most exposed to the possibility of infection owing to the squalid living conditions, inadequate workplace health and safety protection, and little or no social protection coverage. There are situations compounded by factors such as social exclusion, social ills such as xenophobia and racism. We saw this during the pandemic where, because now, given the tough conditions, then you get xenophobic tendencies and also racist behavior. This reality is unfortunate because maintaining the good health of migrants has been shown to bring economic benefits to the socio-economic development of both countries of origin and the destination. With that said, colleagues, I would like now to switch over to point 6 of this talk, which is social protection responses to COVID-19. We talked about the challenges, we talked about those that are affected. Now, what were the responses? By way of an overview, according to the World Bank, ladies and gentlemen, natural and man-made shocks such as pandemics, natural disasters, economic crisis, fragility and conflict, and forced displacement have become increasingly frequent, interconnected, and devastating in recent decades. SADC countries have had their fair share of natural and man-made shocks, and it's a given that there will be more. There will be more, ladies and gentlemen. These shocks hurt social protection programs. There's no doubt about it. If people are not in employment, who contributes? How can people contribute? But yet, the social protection programs are expected to, and they in reality do play a role, albeit limited, in mitigating the impact of the shocks. The impact of the current crisis, namely COVID-19, on social protection is not different. As Barrientos puts it, and I quote, in theory, social protection has limited role in addressing pandemics like COVID-19, but it can be effective in protecting the population from its economic effects. At its core, insurance addresses idiosyncratic risks that randomly affect fractions of the population. Where unemployment or poor health strikes a small proportion of the labor force, a small premium collected from each worker could finance compensation to those affected. Close quotes. Let's have a quick look at selected risks under point 6, and I'll start with health. The SADC region, or Southern African Development Community, recognizes the important fact that a healthy population is a prerequisite for sustainable human development and increased productivity in the member states. The health needs of the inhabitants of the SADC member states are predominantly taken care of through a health system that consists of public and private healthcare service providers. Apart from Western allopathic medicine, the SADC does recognize the prevalence and relevance of traditional healing practices in the region by calling for their regulation. Public health services in SADC countries are generally used by those individuals who cannot afford private health services, such as the unemployed and the informally employed. Accordingly, the public health services are financed through general taxes and, to a limited degree, user fees. Despite being used by the indigent and marginalized, public health facilities are generally understaffed and ill-equipped in many SADC countries. It should be mentioned that private healthcare in SADC countries is invariably expensive and situated in urban areas. This is the context within which efforts to deal with COVID-19 must operate. These are the realities that cannot be ignored if any meaningful progress is to be made by the SADC member states in their quest to fight the pandemic and provide meaningful healthcare to their populations. The greatest challenge, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, is that such efforts must take place without compromising the current programs that are aimed at controlling and, where possible, eradicating diseases such as HIV and AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Consequently, the rollout of COVID-19 vaccination programs has to take place alongside, for example, the ongoing provision of antiretroviral drugs in many SADC countries. This begs the question, how is the SADC region doing in its quest to cap the spread of the COVID-19 disease through vaccinations? At the regional level, the picture that emerges, it's uninspiring, or at least at the start. SADC had a slow start, and for a variety of reasons. And there was a shortage of vaccines and so on. And when they became available, a large number of people also vaccinated, but we still have those that are hesitant for a variety of reasons to vaccinate. Talking now about unemployment, still under point 6, one of the consequences of the pandemic is full and in some instances partial unemployment. This situation is compounded by the high prevalence of informal sector employment and the shortage of mandatory social insurance, including those concerning unemployment in the region. SADC member countries introduced several initiatives to deal with the risk. These initiatives supplemented those provided by the relevant social protection programs where such a scheme exists. They include the redundancy payment. This payment, or in a casual manner, is known as retrenchment package, is an amount of money which is paid to redundant employees as compensation for having been discharged due to no fault of their own. But the value of the money payable invariably depends on the past earnings and the length of service. The cost of redundancy payment is in most instances covered by employers, either individually or with the assistance of a special fund to which employers as a whole contribute. South Africa, which is one of the SADC countries with an unemployment insurance fund, launched some unemployment-related initiatives such as the so-called temporary employer relief scheme benefit. In brief, TERS. The TERS benefits are provided to employees and employers who have closed operations or part thereof due to COVID. The introduction of the scheme is commendable. Nonetheless, it is regrettable that it is marked by, among others, fraud and corruption. Unintended beneficiaries such as civil servants, prisoners, and ghost beneficiaries are reported to have benefited from this scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, social protection schemes must be administered, and with the introduction of temporary benefit schemes, we have noticed in the region that the administrative capabilities of many social protection schemes, was lacking. Many SADC countries' social protection schemes rely heavily on paper-based, transactions, and as a result, because of these paper-based processes and walk-ins and so on, it was difficult to disburse some of these benefits and also on time. And also the reliance of manual systems instead of online systems was also problematic. So this highlights a need for SADC countries to modernize their systems. These schemes must also be financed, and COVID-19 put a serious strain on the revenue of various governments, and in so doing, it made it difficult in some instances for governments to provide. Obviously, there are those that took risks with international lending organizations because of the slump in taxes and levies, because people were not moving and all that. And the importance of this really, it shows fiscal discipline is important, and also addressing factors such as corruption and fraud, that really money that should be used to alleviate, or address the plight of the poor goes to the people who are connected or people who are linked to some corrupt officials and so on. And this requires special attention if there's anything to be learned. To wrap up, colleagues, I'm going now to point 7, which is the key observations. And if you like, you could say also lessons learned. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a well-known fact that the scope of coverage of social protection systems of the SADC member states is limited. These schemes habitually exclude those persons that eke a living in the informal sector as well as the self-employed workers. Many migrant workers that are engaged in this sector are excluded and marginalized from the limited social protection available in these countries. In fact, it is a fact that without appropriate social protection mechanisms that cover workers in all forms of employment, including self-employment, millions of workers will fall into poverty or fall deeper into poverty as their earnings declined sharply during the pandemic. Some migrant workers struggle to access much needed health services due to their undocumented status. The SADC member states must work hard at improving their social protection system and their healthcare sector by making such systems and sectors accessible to all. The point is that social protection system is invariably the first port of call in terms of crisis, and such a system is of no meaningful use if it is in crisis itself. And I argue that SADC member states can benefit from the International Labour Organization instruments, which include the Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilient Recommendation 205 of 2017, and the Social Protection Floors Recommendation of 2020, number 202 of 2012. Another crucial point to note is that government services aimed at aiding the members of the society, including migrant workers and their families, can be rendered futile and useless if they are not accessible due to lack of information and access to social networks. It is therefore important that relevant measures are put in place to ensure that information reaches migrants and their families, considering inter alia their inadequate language skills. And such measures should ensure that migrant workers are aware of protection, prevention, and treatment measures and their social protection rights during the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, migrant workers should be informed about their social protection rights and entitlements and how to access them. Raising migrant workers and their families' awareness about preventative measures to be adopted and the health protection measures and services available to them, it is important to reduce the risk of contamination and transmission. Migrant workers should also be informed about relevant COVID-19 response measures adopted by authorities in the country of destination that may affect their employment, living, or travel conditions. A change in their employment or migratory status may have an impact on their needs and their access to social protection and income replacement measures. Information needs to be made available in a language that migrant workers can understand, also taking into account the number of illiterate workers from whom visual and auditory forms of communication may be required. In brief, COVID-19 has exposed the absence and, in some instances, inadequacies of the social protection measures in the SADC region, which must be addressed. I'm aware that I'm 2 minutes over the allocated time. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, allow me to pause there, and with the hope that I've said enough so that we can have a meaningful discussion. Thank you very much for your attention, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I think you are mute, Dr. Huta.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you, sir, for your excellent presentation. Now I invite any questions from our faculty colleagues, students, any participants, they can post here so that I'll try to convey to sir.
I hope that you could hear me. I was not too fast.
Absolutely, sir.
Okay.
Okay, I can begin. Why to wait for others? You have an interesting observation, sir, related to the crowding of the houses. And how does it relate to the access of devices and leading towards the violence in the family? Could you throw some light on that?
In countries such as South Africa, if I understood you well, let me start by pointing that in countries such as South Africa, we have a situation where, and it's historical in nature, because of job opportunities which are in big cities, you get a lot of overcrowding because people need to settle near big cities. But now housing in cities is expensive for many people, including migrant workers. So we've got this phenomenon of the so-called informal dwellings. We call them squatter camps. And these are houses, it's really rudimentary houses which are close to each other. They lack sanitation, they lack water. It's really sad that people will live under such conditions. And often where there's this kind of overcrowding, there are all sorts of risks, in terms of health, because people use same, there would be one communal tap for water. Sanitation, there would be one place where people can go. And because of these competing for resources, we have certainly experienced xenophobic attacks, where some locals, are taking non-citizens and all that, which is really sad. But if you look at it, it's about access to housing, which is, by the way, a human right in our constitution. And I must say, a lot has been done in providing low-cost housing, but the need is so huge, and as a result, more has to be done. People could argue that there is no money for this, but if you look at the money that is stolen, the money that is lost through corruption and fraud, this is a need that can be met, and without any trouble, if these billions that are stolen are plowed or are used in a right way. So to answer you, this does lead to conflict, and if not, it does also affect the right of people to live as human beings. As I indicated, if you have a shack dwelling or informal dwelling where 6 or more people share that, in a COVID-19 situation, it's a recipe for disaster. And we saw it with the police, more violence was from the police. People like that can't isolate. There are instances where if a member of the family wants to take a bath, others must go and wait outside. And the police would say, "Why are you standing outside? You must go back." And people, were certainly assaulted by the police. But the reality is the sad situation of these people who live in informal sectors. Lastly, people like myself, I'm blessed and privileged. In as much as I was frustrated that I couldn't go out, I couldn't do things, but people who lived in proper houses with water and everything, really, life was easy. But for those that live in these challenging circumstances, it was difficult. And yeah, I hope I've answered you, colleague.
Thank you, sir.
I'm surprised. I know Indian students, my Indian students last time at Myanmar had lots of questions. Today, I don't know why, unless if they are not behind, the names that you are seeing on the screen.
Yeah, there was a question from my colleague, Shreya. Did women face barriers to access to technology during the lockdowns? And did that impact their access to help in case of domestic violence, which became a shadow pandemic? Your views, sir.
Yeah, thank you, colleague. One of the things that we picked during the pandemic, it was the rise in gender-based violence. And I remember one colleague of mine saying tongue in cheek that we'll need more lawyers because there will be lots of divorces after this lockdown. And also there was a spike in terms of divorces and all this. To answer your question, yes, women were vulnerable and are still vulnerable. Remember, this lockdowns and the COVID situation came, finding countries like South Africa having the highest level of gender-based violence, which is really a sad reality. So we saw campaigns on television in terms of where people can report these, the toll-free numbers and so on. In terms of the easy access to technology and all that, look, it's a fact. South Africa is not bad in terms of technological development, despite being a developing country. But it depends where you are. If you go to my village where I grew up, the network is terrible. You can have a cell phone with data or anything, but it's difficult. You have to climb a tree to be able to make a call. It doesn't help. So the challenge is that this unequal access to connectivity, which is a big problem that we are facing, and that undermines all this effort. Although there were advertisements, about gender-based violence and the numbers to call, unfortunately, these are not accessible to all the women in the country or all the vulnerable people in the country. We still have that disparity in terms of access to technological services and connectivity, by the way. It's still a privilege for many people.
Thank you, sir.
If I can, while waiting for questions, I was a little bit provocative in my presentation and referring to the Indian situation. If I saw wrong things on television and maybe somebody would like to share whether that experience that I saw from a distance is the same, it would also be welcomed in comments. But I also value questions because some of the approaches, I think the whole world, took the same more or less, to lock down and bring the police, the military to control the movement and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Shall I wait for 1 minute? If I can get one more few questions, then we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody is absorbed with your talk, sir, to their heart's content. And I take this formal opportunity to propose you vote of thanks on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University, and on behalf of my colleagues and our all faculty friends and students. The key takeaways for me and for our students will be definitely, you talked about the vulnerability indicators and the way they connect with the migrations, access to technology, and new areas of violence, the policing by the state. And definitely, I would think it will go a longer way for our students to think and ponder upon these points. Once again, thank you, sir, so much for your time and gracing the occasions and made it happen. And once again, I thank our director ma'am, my colleague Shreya, and all the technical staff. Without whose support, this could not be possible. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Have a great day.
if I may, please, Dr. Diva, I would like to take this opportunity and thank Director Parikh, thank Prof. Shreya, thank you, Program Director, and as you rightly pointed out, technical staff. Nothing happens without technical staff, and each and every one of you for setting time aside to come and exchange some thoughts with me this morning, this afternoon in India, and say there is this developing and a relationship that is growing from strength to strength between the University of Johannesburg and the Institute of Law at Nirma University. So should you find yourself in Johannesburg, the University of Johannesburg is your home, and I'll definitely visit again, and we would like to build this relationship and make it even stronger. And should there be any questions, maybe students that would like to do research on this topic and would like to reach out to me for material or to exchange some thoughts, I'm definitely open. And I'm sure through Prof. Shreya, they can get my details and then we can do that. So thank you very much. I wish you a pleasant day further.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's
Okay.
such
Thank
a
you, sir.
nice session, and we are so thankful to you for inviting us to for a long collaboration, and look forward to you into the long relationship. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mpedi. My colleague, Mr. Ramesh, is also here. You were
Hello, hello, sir, Mpedi, sir.
Hello,
Hello.
Institute Superintendent Ramesh. So good to see you. I like your title.
Thank you.
Sounds
Thank you very much, sir. We will eagerly waiting for your presence on our campus. We'll be waiting to see. Yeah. We are also looking forward to see you.
Yeah.
Next time, I think next time we can meet together.
Yeah, it will definitely happen this year. I've already talked to Director Parikh and Prof. Shreya and Dr. Diba.
Okay, sir.
We'll organize something in person. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy for that, sir. Happy to receive you, sir. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Have a very good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.